I was 29 years old, sitting in my childhood bedroom in Sacramento, California, staring at rejection emails on my cracked laptop screen. When my mother knocked on the door and told me I was embarrassing the family, my name is Zoe Peterson. And that night I decided I was done trying to make them understand why I wanted to open an art therapy center for trauma survivors instead of becoming a corporate lawyer like my older sister Miranda. The air in that room smelled like dust and failure. The walls still covered in participation ribbons from high school that now felt like little monuments to mediocrity. And I could hear my father's voice downstairs telling someone on the phone that his youngest daughter was still unemployed at 29, living at home like a child, chasing dreams that would never pay the bills. I had moved back 6 months earlier after my nonprofit job in Denver fell apart. The organization lost funding, and I lost my apartment in the same week, and coming home felt like crawling back into a cage I had spent years trying to escape. Miranda lived in a glass-walled penthouse in San Francisco with her hedge fund manager husband. She wore designer clothes and posted pictures of charity galas on social media while making jokes at family dinners about how I was the family's cautionary tale, the one who chose passion over practicality and ended up with nothing. My brother Ryan was almost as bad. He worked in tech sales and drove a Tesla, and every time he saw me, he would ask when I was going to get serious about life, as if my master's degree in counseling psychology and 5 years working with traumatized children meant nothing because I couldn't afford a luxury car. The worst part was not their success. I could have handled that. The worst part was Thanksgiving dinner, 2 months before everything changed, when my mother stood up at the head of the table and said she had an announcement. She said they had decided to update their will and trust documents. And since Miranda and Ryan had proven themselves to be responsible adults with stable careers, they would be receiving the bulk of the estate while I would get a small amount held in a trust that would only release funds if I used them for approved purposes like going back to school for a real degree. I sat there with cranberry sauce turning to acid in my mouth while everyone nodded like this made perfect sense, like I was a reckless teenager who could not be trusted with money instead of an adult woman who had dedicated her life to helping people heal from trauma. Miranda actually smiled at me across the table, that thin-lipped smile she had perfected in childhood. The one that said, "I won and you lost." And Ryan raised his wine glass and said, "At least this would motivate me to finally grow up." I did not cry at the table. I waited until I was in the bathroom with the door locked and the fan running. And then I cried so hard I thought I might vomit. The humiliation burned worse than any physical pain I had ever felt. That night, I applied to every grant, every fellowship, every opportunity I could find that might fund my dream of opening a trauma therapy center. I sent out 43 applications in 2 weeks. I wrote proposals until my eyes burned and my fingers cramped. I poured everything I had learned from working with children who had survived abuse and violence into detailed program descriptions that explained how art therapy could help people process experiences that words alone could not touch. The rejection emails came like clockwork. "Thank you for your interest, but we have decided to pursue other candidates. We received an overwhelming number of applications. We wish you the best in your future endeavors." I was eating ramen noodles for the third night in a row when the email arrived from the Hartley Foundation, a private nonprofit organization based in San Francisco that funded innovative mental health programs. They wanted to interview me for a $200,000 grant. My hands shook so badly I could barely type a response. The interview was in person, and I had to borrow a suit from a friend because I had sold most of my professional clothes months ago to pay for groceries. The Hartley Foundation offices were in a converted warehouse in the Mission District, all exposed brick and industrial lighting, and the program director was a woman in her 50s named Dr. Elizabeth Chen, who had kind eyes and asked me questions that proved she had actually read my entire proposal. I told her about working with a 9-year-old girl in Denver who had not spoken in 2 years after witnessing domestic violence, how she started drawing in our sessions, how the pictures she created helped her process what had happened and eventually helped her find her voice again. I told Dr. Chen that trauma lives in the body and the nervous system, and sometimes talking about it just re-traumatizes people, but art creates a safe distance, a way to express the inexpressible. Dr. Chen was quiet for a long moment after I finished talking. Then she said she had read hundreds of proposals, but mine was the only one that made her cry. She said I would have the grant on one condition. I had to commit to staying in the Bay Area and building the program here where the foundation could support it and monitor its success. I said yes before she finished the sentence. I would have said yes to almost anything. And 2 weeks later, I had a check for $200,000 and a small office space in Oakland that the foundation helped me secure at below market rent. I did not tell my family right away. I spent the first month setting up the center, hiring 2 part-time therapists who specialized in trauma work, purchasing art supplies and comfortable furniture that did not feel clinical or cold, painting the walls in soft blues and greens that research showed helped calm the nervous system. I called it the Meadow Center for Healing Arts because I wanted the name to evoke safety and growth, somewhere you could rest and slowly come back to life. Our first clients were referrals from domestic violence shelters and foster care agencies, children and adults who carried wounds that most people could not see. And watching them create art and slowly start to heal made me feel like I was finally doing what I was meant to do with my life. 6 months after opening, a journalist from the San Francisco Chronicle did a story about alternative approaches to trauma therapy and featured the Meadow Center. The article was published on a Sunday, and by Monday morning, my phone was ringing constantly. Therapists wanting to refer clients, donors wanting to contribute, other nonprofits wanting to collaborate. That was when I finally told my family. I sent them the article link in our family group chat with no explanation, just the link. Miranda responded first. She said this was great, and she was happy for me, but I should be careful not to let success go to my head. Ryan sent a thumbs up emoji and nothing else. My mother called and asked if this meant I would finally be able to move out of their house. I had actually already signed a lease on a small apartment in Oakland 2 weeks earlier, but I did not tell her that. I just said yes and ended the call. The center grew faster than I had anticipated. Within a year, we had expanded to serve over 100 clients, and I had hired 5 full-time staff members. The Hartley Foundation was so impressed with our outcomes that they increased their funding and helped us apply for additional grants. We won 3 more in the next 6 months. I was interviewed on local news programs, invited to speak at psychology conferences, asked to consult with other organizations trying to implement trauma-informed care. And through it all, my family treated it like a nice hobby. I had turned into a small business. Nothing worth celebrating too much. Everything changed the night my father had his stroke. He was 67 years old and had spent his entire adult life working 80-hour weeks as a corporate tax attorney, and the stroke left him partially paralyzed on his right side with significant speech difficulties. The doctors said he would need months of rehabilitation and probably would never fully recover. He could barely form sentences, and the frustration of not being able to communicate made him aggressive and depressed. He would throw things during physical therapy sessions and refuse to participate in speech therapy. Miranda called me 3 weeks after the stroke, her voice tight with stress. She said they had tried 4 different rehabilitation facilities and Dad kept getting kicked out for behavioral problems. So the neurologist said his inability to express himself was causing severe psychological distress and recommended therapy. But traditional talk therapy was impossible given his speech limitations. I knew what she was going to ask before she said it. I could hear the desperation under her usual confidence, and part of me wanted to say no, wanted to remind her of every dismissive comment and pitying look. But I was not my family. I had not built the Meadow Center to withhold healing from people who had hurt me. I told her to bring him to the center. Miranda actually laughed. She said Dad would never agree to art therapy. He thought that kind of thing was nonsense for people who could not handle real problems. But I told her he did not have to agree. He just had to show up. They arrived on a Tuesday morning. Miranda pushing Dad in a wheelchair, Ryan walking beside them looking uncomfortable, and my mother trailing behind with her purse clutched against her chest like a shield. The look on my father's face when he saw the center was something between confusion and anger. His left hand gripped the wheelchair arm, and he made a sound that might have been a word or might have been just frustration. I led them to my office, which was really more of a studio. North-facing windows, letting in soft light, tables covered with art supplies, paintings from clients covering the walls, and I pulled out a chair for my father and set up a large piece of paper and some charcoal pencils. Miranda said this was not going to work. Dad did not draw. He had never been interested in art. But I ignored her, and I looked at my father, and I said, sometimes when words fail us, images can speak. I said he did not have to create anything beautiful. He just had to put the charcoal on the paper and see what happened. He stared at me for a long time with his left eye slightly drooping, and then he picked up a piece of charcoal with his left hand and made a single harsh line across the paper. The line was angry, jagged, and I said, good. I said, show me more of that anger. My family watched in silence as my father covered the paper in violent marks, scratches and scribbles that looked like chaos. But I could see what he was doing. He was releasing something that had been trapped inside him since the stroke. All that rage and fear and grief at losing control of his own body. When he finally stopped, his shoulders were heaving and tears were running down his face, and I handed him another piece of paper and said, "Now show me what you are afraid of." This time the marks were smaller, tighter, clustered in the center of the page like something trying to hide or protect itself, and my mother made a small sound in her throat like she might cry. We worked like that for 2 hours. I gave him prompts and he drew, and slowly the images became less abstract, more specific. A house that might have been his childhood home, a figure that might have been him before the stroke, a dark space that represented everything he had lost. By the end of the session, my father was exhausted but calmer than my family had seen him in weeks, and Miranda pulled me aside while Ryan helped Dad back into the wheelchair. She asked how much I charged for private sessions. I told her we operated on a sliding scale based on income, and for family members of staff, the sessions were free, and I watched her face process this information, the realization that I was giving them something valuable without asking for anything in return. Dad came to the center 3 times a week for the next 4 months. Slowly, his artwork became more controlled and more expressive. He started creating images that told stories about his life, his career, his fears about mortality and dependence, and as he processed these feelings through art, his behavior and physical therapy improved. He stopped fighting the rehabilitation because he had found another way to feel in control. His speech came back gradually, partial but functional. And the first full sentence he said to me was, "Thank you for not giving up on me," and I realized he thought I had been about to refuse to help him. The center's reputation grew even more after word spread that we were helping stroke survivors and others with neurological conditions who struggled with traditional therapy. We started receiving referrals from hospitals and rehabilitation facilities, and I had to hire additional staff to meet the demand. Miranda started volunteering at the center on weekends. She said she needed to do something meaningful with her life beyond corporate law, and watching her interact with clients, seeing her learn to be patient and compassionate instead of dismissive, was strange and satisfying in ways I had not expected. Ryan made a substantial donation to the center after his company did well in an IPO, and my mother joined our board of directors and used her connections to help us fundraise. They never apologized for the will or the Thanksgiving announcement or the years of mockery, but they changed their will anyway. I found out when Miranda accidentally mentioned it. While we were cleaning up the studio one Saturday, she said Mom and Dad had redone everything to split the estate equally 3 ways because they realized they had been unfair. I did not need their money anymore. The Meadow Center paid me a decent salary, and I had started a small private practice on the side. I had savings and a retirement account and a life I had built entirely on my own terms, but the gesture mattered anyway. The acknowledgement that they had been wrong. The real shift came 18 months after my father's stroke. We were hosting our annual fundraising gala at a hotel in downtown San Francisco, a fancy event with 200 guests and a silent auction, and my father insisted on speaking, even though public speaking was difficult for him now. He stood at the podium with my mother beside him for support, and he spoke slowly and carefully about how he had spent his whole life believing that success meant money and status and measurable achievements, and how his stroke had taught him that he had been measuring the wrong things. He said, "I had built something more valuable than any corporate career because I had built something that healed people, including him, and he said he was sorry it took him so long to understand what I had been trying to do." The room was silent except for the sound of people crying, and Miranda was sobbing openly at the table, her perfect makeup ruined, and Ryan had his head down like he could not look at anyone, and my mother was holding my father's hand so tightly her knuckles were white. I sat at the front table in a dress I had bought with my own money, in a room full of people who respected my work, surrounded by staff members who trusted my leadership and clients whose lives had genuinely changed because of what we had built together, and I felt something release in my chest that I had been carrying for years. After the gala, my father pulled me aside in the hotel lobby. The space smelled like expensive perfume and champagne, and he said he knew he could not take back the things he had said or the ways he had dismissed my dreams, but he wanted me to know that I had saved his life twice, once by helping him heal after the stroke, and once by showing him what actually mattered. I told him I did not do it for gratitude or vindication. I did it because it was the right thing to do. And because I had learned a long time ago that the best response to people who doubt you is not to prove them wrong, but to build something so undeniable that their doubt becomes irrelevant. He nodded slowly and said, I had done exactly that, and then he said something I will never forget. He said the cruelest thing he ever did was make me feel small for wanting to help people, and the kindest thing I ever did was help him anyway. Now, when we have family dinners, we talk about the center's clients and upcoming programs. Miranda brings her corporate law expertise to help with contracts and liability issues. Ryan uses his tech connections to help us build better systems for tracking client outcomes. And my parents treat my work with the same respect they once reserved only for traditional markers of success. Sometimes, late at night when I'm alone in my apartment in Oakland, looking out at the city lights and thinking about everything that has happened, I remember sitting in my childhood bedroom reading rejection emails and feeling like my life was over. And I think about how wrong I was. My life was not ending, it was just beginning. But first, I had to stop trying to earn approval from people who measured worth in dollars and titles instead of impact and meaning. They needed me to fail so they could feel superior. But I refused to fail. And now they need me for reasons they never anticipated. Not for money or status, but for the thing they had finally learned to value, the ability to heal what has been broken and create meaning from pain. That is the thing about proving yourself to people who doubted you. The sweetest moment is not when they finally admit you were right. It is when they realize they need what only you can give them, and they have to come to you with empty hands and ask for help, knowing they have no right to expect you will say yes.